Hi, welcome back to Storytime. So we are going to be continuing with, let me find it, it's right here, Orlando. And I think we're on chapter 5, just double checking. Oh, never mind, it's chapter 4, so my bad. We'll have to change the title of the stream later after we finish. But yeah, we've been doing about a chapter per story time because her Virginia Woolf, at least, I don't know, this is the first Virginia Woolf I've ever read, but the chapters in Orlando are very, very long. Last week's was the shortest of the chapters, and it only took us an hour to read, but since this one is going to be about twice as long, I figured that it would be better to just do a short stream last time instead of a long stream, and so we're going to be continuing with it today. I'll find the beginning of it. Oh, and before I begin, almost forgot. Alright, so if you're all set, we will go ahead and get started. Maestro. There we go. Chapter 4. With some of the guineas left from the sale of the 10th pearl of her string, Orlando had bought herself a complete outfit of such clothes as women then wore, and it was in the dress of a young Englishwoman of rank that she now sat on the deck of the enamoured lady. It is a strange fact, but a true one, that up to this moment she had scarcely given her sex a thought. Perhaps the Turkish trousers, which she had hitherto worn, had done something to distract her thoughts, and the gypsy women expect in one or two important particulars, differ very little from the gypsy men. At any rate, it was not until she felt the coil of skirts about her legs, and the captain offered, with the greatest politeness, to have an awning spread for her on deck, that she realized with a start the penalties and the privileges of her position. But that start was not of the kind that might have been expected. If you're just joining us, the first 2 chapters of the story, Orlando was a man, and then in the beginning, or at the very end of the 2nd chapter, I believe it was, she awoke a woman, and so the whole 3rd chapter she was just existing with the gypsies as a woman, didn't really give it a thought. It was not caused, that is to say, simply and solely by the thought of her chastity and how she could preserve it. In normal circumstances, a lovely young woman alone would have thought of nothing else. The whole edifice of female government is based on that foundation stone. Chastity is her jewel, her centerpiece, which they run mad to protect and die when ravished of. But if one has been a man for 30 years or so, and an ambassador into the bargain, if one has held a queen in one's arm, and 1 or 2 other ladies, if reports be true, of less exalted rank, if one has married a Rosina Pepita, and so on, one does not perhaps give such a very great start about it. Orlando's start was of very complicated kind, and not to be summed up in a thrice. Nobody, indeed, ever accused her of being one of those quick wits who run to the end of things in a minute. It took her the entire length of the voyage to moralize out the meaning of her start, and so, at her own pace, we will follow her. Lord, she thought when she had recovered from her start, stretching herself out at length under her awning, this is a pleasant, lazy way of life, to be sure, but, she thought, giving her legs a kick, these skirts are plaguey things to have about one's heels. Yet the stuff flowered paduasoy on the loveliest in the world. Never have I seen my own skin. Here she laid her hand on her knee, looked to such advantage as now. Could I, however, leap overboard and swim in clothes like these? No. Therefore I should have to trust to the protection of a blue jacket. But do I object to that? No, do I? She wondered, here encountering the first knot in the in the smooth skein of her argument. Dinner came before she had untied them, and then it was the captain himself, Captain Nicholas Benedict Bartolos, a sea captain of distinguished aspect, who did it for her as he helped her to a slice of corned beef. "A little of the fat, ma'am?" he asked. "Let me cut you just the tiniest little slice, the size of your fingernail." At those words a delicious tremor ran through her frame. Birds sang, the torrents rushed. It recalled the feelings of indescribable pleasure with which she had first seen Sasha hundreds of years ago. Then she had pursued, now she fled. Which is the greater ecstasy, the man's or the woman's? And are they not perhaps the same? No, she thought, this is the most delicious, thanking the captain but refusing. To refuse and see him frown? Well, she would, if he wished it, have the very tiniest, smallest sliver in the world. This was the most delicious of all, to yield and see him smile. For nothing, she thought, regaining her couch on deck, and continued the argument. It's more heavenly than to resist and to yield. To yield and to resist. Surely it throws the spirit into such a rapture as nothing else can. So that I'm not sure, she continued, that I throw myself overboard for the mere pleasure of being rescued by a bluejacket after all. It must be remembered that she was like a child entering into possession of a pleasaunce or toy cupboard. Her arguments would not commend themselves to mature women who have had the run of it all their lives. But what used we young fellows in the cockpit of the Marie Rose to say about a woman who threw herself overboard for the pleasure of being rescued by a bluejacket? She said. We had a word for them. Ah, I have it. But we must omit that word. It was disrespectful in the extreme and passing strange on a lady's lips. Lord, Lord, she cried again at the conclusion of her thoughts. Then must I then begin to respect the opinion of the other sex, however monstrous I think it? If I wear skirts, if I can't swim, if I have to be rescued by a bluejacket, by God, she cries, I must. Upon which a gloom fell over her. Candid by nature, and averse to all kinds of equivocation, to tell lies bored her. It seemed to her a roundabout way of going to work. Yet she reflected the flowered paduasoy, the pleasure of being rescued by a bluejacket. If these were only to be obtained by roundabout ways, roundabout one must go, she supposed. She remembered how, as a young man, she had insisted that women must be obedient, chaste, scented, and exquisitely apparelled. Now I shall have to pay in my own person for those desires, she reflected. For women are not, judging by my own short experience of the sex, obedient, chaste, scented, and exquisitely apparelled by nature. They can only attain these graces, without which they may enjoy none of the delights of life, by the most tedious discipline. There's the hairdressing, she thought, that alone will take an hour of my morning. There's looking in the looking-glass another hour. There's staying and lacing. There's washing and powdering. There's changing from silk to lace and from lace to paduasoy. There's being chaste year in, year out. Here she tossed her foot impatiently and showed an inch or two of calf. A sailor at the mast, who happened to look down at the moment, started so violently that he missed his footing and only saved himself by the skin of his teeth. The sight of my ankles means death to an honest fellow who, no doubt, has a wife and family to support. I must in all humanity keep them covered, Orlando thought. Yet her legs were among her chiefest beauties, and she fell to thinking what an odd pass we have come to, when all a woman's beauty has to be kept covered lest a sailor may fall from a masthead. A pox on them, she said, realizing for the first time what, in other circumstances, she would have been taught as a child, that is to say, the sacred responsibilities of womanhood. And that's the last oath I shall ever be able to swear, she thought. Once I set foot on English soil, and I shall never be able to crack a man over the head, or tell him he lies in his teeth, or draw my sword and run him through the body, or sit among my peers, or wear a coronet, or walk in procession, and sentence a man to death, or lead an army, or prance down Whitehall on a charger, or wear 72 different medals on my breast. All I can do, once I set foot on English soil, is to pour out tea and ask my lords how they like it. Do you take sugar? Do you take cream? Mincing out the words, she was horrified to perceive how low an opinion she was forming of the other sex, the manly to which it had once been her pride to belong. To fall from a masthead, she thought, because you see a woman's ankles? To dress up like a Guy Fawkes and parade the streets so that women may praise you. To deny a woman teaching lest she may laugh at you, to be the slave of the frailest chit in petticoats, and yet to go about as if you were the lords of creation. Heavens, she thought, what fools they make of us, what fools we are! And here it would seem, from some ambiguity in her terms, that she was censuring both sexes equally, as if she belonged to neither, and indeed, for the time being, she seemed to vacillate. She was man, she was woman, she knew the secrets, shared the weaknesses of each. It was a most bewildering and whirligig state of mind to be in. The comforts of ignorance seemed utterly denied her. She was a feather blown on the gale. Thus it is no great wonder, as she pitted one sex against the other, and found each alternately full of the most deplorable infirmities, and was not sure of which she belonged. It was no great wonder that she was about to cry out that she would return to Turkey, and become a gypsy again when the anchor fell with a great splash into the sea. The sails came tumbling on deck, and she perceived, so sunk as she had she been in thought, that she had seen nothing for several days, that the ship was anchored off the coast of Italy. The captain at once sent to ask the honor of her company ashore with him in the long-boat. When she returned the next morning, she stretched herself on her couch under the awning, and arranged her draperies with the greatest decorum about her ankles. Ignorant and poor as we are compared with the other sex, she thought, continuing the sentence which she had left unfinished the other day, armed with every weapon as they are, while they debar us even from a knowledge of the alphabet, and from these opening words, it is plain that something had happened during the night to give her a push towards the female sex, for she was speaking more as a woman speaks than as a man, yet with a sort of content after all. Still, if they fall from the masthead. Here she gave a great yawn and fell asleep. When she woke, the ship was sailing before a fair breeze, so near the shore that towns on the cliff's edge seemed only kept from slipping into the water by the interposition of some great rock or a twisted root of some ancient olive tree. The scent of oranges wafted from a million trees, heavy with the fruit, reaching her on deck. A score of blue dolphins, twisting their tails, leapt high now and again into the air. Stretching their arms she had learnt already, have no such fatal effects as legs. She thanked heaven that she was not prancing down Whitehall on a white war-horse, nor even sentencing a man to death. Better it is, she thought, to be clothed with poverty and ignorance, which are the dark garments of the female sex. Better to leave the rule and discipline of the world to others. Better be quit of martial ambition, the love of power, and all the other manly desires, if so one can more fully enjoy the most exalted raptures known to the human spirit, which are, she said aloud, as her habit was when deeply moved, contemplation, solitude, love. "Oh, praise God that I'm a woman!" she cried. and was about to run into the extreme folly, than which none is more distressing in woman or man either, of being proud of her sex, when she paused over the singular word, which, for all we can do to put it in its place, has crept in at the end of the last sentence. Love. Love, said Orlando, instantly, such as it is impetuosity. Love took a human form, such as its pride. Or where other thoughts are content to remain abstract, nothing will satisfy this one, but to put on flesh and blood, mantilla and petticoats, hose and jerkin, and as all Orlando's loves had been woman now, though the culpable laggardry of the human frame to adapt itself to convention, though she herself was a woman, it was still a woman she loved, and if the consciousness of being of the same sex had any effect at all, it was to quicken and deepen those feelings which she had as a man. For now 1,000 hints and mysteries became plain to her that they. For now 1,000 hints and mysteries became plain to her that were then dark. Now the obscurity which divides the sexes and lets linger innumerable impurities in its gloom was removed, and if there is anything in what the poet says about truth and beauty, its affection gained in beauty that is lost in falsity. At last she cried, she knew Sasha as she was, and in the ardor of this discovery, in the pursuit of all those treasures which were now revealed, she was so rapt and enchanted that it was as if a cannonball had exploded in her ear when a man's voice said, "Permit me, madam." A man's hand raised her to her feet, and the fingers of a man with a 3-masted sailing ship tattooed on the middle finger pointed to the horizon. "The cliffs of England, ma'am," said the captain, and he raised the hand which had pointed at the sky to the salute. Orlando gave a second start, even more violent than the first. "Jesus Christ!" she cried. Happily, the sight of her native land, after long absence, excused both start and exclamation, or she would have been hard put to it to explain to Captain Bartolus the raging and conflicting emotions which now boiled within her. How tell him that she, who now trembled on his arm, had been a duke and an ambassador? How explain to him that she, who had been lapped like a lily in the folds of Paduasoy, had hacked heads off and lain with loose women among treasure sacks in the holds of pirate ships on summer nights when the tulips were abloom and the bees buzzing off wapping old stairs? Not even to herself could she explain the giant start she gave as the resolute right hand of the sea captain indicated the cliffs of the British Isles. To refuse and to yield, she murmured. How delightful! To pursue and to conquer, how august! To perceive and to reason, how sublime! Not one of these words so coupled together seemed to her wrong. Nevertheless, as the chalky cliffs loomed nearer, she felt culpable, dishonored, unchaste, which, for one who has never given the matter a thought, was strange. Closer and closer they drew, till the samphire gatherers, hanging halfway down the cliff, were plain to the naked eye, and watching them, she felt scampering up and down within her like some derisive ghost who in another instant will pick up her skirts and flaunt out of sight Sasha the lost, Sasha the memory, whose reality she had proved just now so surprisingly. Sasha, she felt, moping and mowing and making all sorts of disrespectful gestures toward the cliff and the samphire gatherers, and when the sailors began chanting, "So goodbye and adieu to you, ladies of Spain," the words echoed in Orlando's sad heart, and she felt that however much landing there meant comfort, meant opulence, meant consequence and state, for she would doubtless pick up some noble prince and reign, his consort over half Yorkshire. Still, if it meant conventionality, meant slavery, meant deceit, meant denying her love, fettering her limbs, pursing her lips, and restraining her tongue, and she would turn about with the ship and set sail once more for the gypsies. I'm a little off-center. Let's fix that. Nope, that's even worse. There we go. Among the hurry of these thoughts, however, there now rose, like a dome of smooth white marble, something which, whether fact or fancy, was so impressive to her fevered imagination that she settled upon it as one had seen a swarm of vibrant dragonflies alight. With apparent satisfaction, upon the glass bell which shelters some tender vegetable, the form of it, by the hazard of fancy, recalled the earliest, the most persistent memory, the man with the big forehead in Twitchett's sitting room, the man who sat writing, or rather looking, but certainly not at her, for he never seemed to see her poised there in all her finery. Lovely boy though she must have been, she could not deny it, and whenever she thought of him, the thought spread round it like the risen moon on turbulent waters, a sheet of silver calm. Now her hand went to her bosom. The other was still in the captain's keeping, where the pages of her poem were hidden safe. It might have been a talisman that she kept there. The distinction of sex, which hers was, and what it meant, subsided. She thought how only if of the glory of poetry, and the great lines of Marlowe, Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, Milton, began booming and reverberating, as if a golden clapper beat against a golden bell in the cathedral tower, which was her mind. The truth was that the image of the marble suggested a poet's forehead, and thus started a flock of irreverent ideas, and was no figment, but a reality. And as the ship advanced down the Thames before a favoring gale, the image with all its associations gave place to the truth, and revealed itself as nothing more and nothing less than the dome of a vast cathedral, rising among a fretwork of white spires. "St. Paul's," said Captain Bartolus, who stood by her side. "The Tower of London," he continued. "Greenwich Hospital, erected in memory of Queen Mary by her husband, his late Majesty, William III. Westminster Abbey, the Houses of Parliament." As he spoke, each of these famous buildings rose to view. It was a fine September morning. A myriad of little watercraft plied from bank to bank. Rarely was a gayer or more interesting spectacle presented itself to the gaze of a returned traveler. Orlando hung over the prow, absorbed in wonder. Her eyes had been used too long to savages and nature not to be entranced by these urban glories. That, then, was the dome of St. Paul's, which Mr. Wren had built during her absence. Nearby, a shock of golden hair burst from a pillar. Captain Bartolus was at her side to inform her that that was the monument, where there had been a plague and a fire during her absence, he said. Do what she would to restrain them, the tears came to her eyes, until remembering that it is becoming in a woman to weep, she let them flow. Here, she thought, had been the great carnival. Here, where the waves slapped briskly, had stood the royal pavilion. Here she had first met Sasha. About here, she looked down into the sparkling waters. One had been used to see the frozen bumboat woman with her apples on her lap. All that splendor and corruption was gone. Gone, too, was the dark night, the monstrous downpour, the violent surges of the flood. Here, where wretches on top, a covey of... missed a sentence. Here, where yellow icebergs had raced circling with a crew of terror-stricken wretches on top, a covey of swans floated, orgulous, undulant, superb. London itself had completely changed since she had last seen it. Then she remembered it had been a hovel of little black beetle-browed houses. The heads of rebels had grinned on pikes at Temple Bar. The cobbled pavements had reeked of garbage and ordure. Now, as the ship sailed past Wapping, she caught glimpses of broad and orderly thoroughfares. Stately coaches, drawn by teams of well-fed horses, stood at the doors of houses whose bow windows, whose plate glass, whose polished knockers testified to the wealth and modest dignity of the dwellers within. Ladies in flowered silk, she put the captain's glass to her eye, walked on raised footpaths. Citizens in broidered coats took snuff at street corners under lamp-posts. She caught sight of a variety of painted signs swinging in the breeze, and could form a rapid notion, from what was painted on them, of the tobacco, of the stuff, of the silk, of the gold, of all the silverware, of the gloves, of the perfume, and of 1,000 other articles which were sold within. Nor could she do more as the ship sailed to its anchorage by London Bridge than glance at coffee-house windows where, on balconies, since the weather was fine, a great number of decent citizens sat at ease, with china dishes in front of them, clay pipes by their sides, while one among them read from a news sheet, and was frequently interrupted by the laughter of the comments of the others. Were these travelers, were these wits, were these poets? She asked of Captain Bartolus, who obligingly informed her that even now, if she turned her head a little to the left and looked along the line of his first finger, so they were passing the cocoa tree where, yes, there he was, one might see Mr. Addison taking his coffee, the other two gentlemen, there, ma'am, a little to the right of the lamp-post, one of them humped, the other much the same as you or me, were Mr. Dryden and Mr. Pope. Sad dogs, said the captain, by which he meant that they were papists, but men of parts none the less, he added, hurrying aft to superintend the arrangements for landing. Addison, Dryden, Pope, Orlando repeated, as if the words were an incantation. For one moment she saw the high mountains above Brusa. The next she had set her foot upon her native shore. But now Orlando was to learn how little the most tempestuous flutter of excitement avails against the iron countenance of the law. How harder than the stones of London Bridge it is, and than the lips of a cannon more severe. No sooner had she returned to her home in Blackfriars than she was made aware of a succession of Bow Street runners and other grave emissaries from the law courts, that she was a party to 3 major suits which had been preferred against her during her absence, as well as innumerable minor litigations, some arising out of, others depending on them. The chief charges against her were, 1, that she was dead, and therefore could not hold any property whatsoever; 2, that she was a woman, which amounts to much the same thing; 3, that she was an English duke who had married one Rosina Pepita, a dancer, and had by her 3 sons, which sons now declared that her father was deceased, claimed that all his property descended to them. Such grave charges as these would, of course, take time and money to dispose of. All her estates were put in chancery, and her titles pronounced in abeyance while the suits were under litigation. Thus it was in a highly ambiguous condition, uncertain whether she was alive or dead, man or woman, duke or nonentity, that she posted down to the country seat, where, pending the legal judgment, she had the law's permission to reside in a state of incognito or incognita, as the case might turn out to be. It was a fine evening in December when she arrived, and the snow was falling, and the violet shadows were slanting much as she had seen them from the hilltop in Brusa. The great house lay more like a town than a house, brown and blue, rose and purple in the snow, with all its chimneys smoking busily as if inspired with a life of their own. She could not restrain a cry as she saw it there, tranquil and massive, couched upon the meadows. As the yellow coach entered the park and came bowling along the drive between the trees, the red deer raised their head as if expectantly, and it was observed that instead of showing the timidity natural to their kind, they followed the coach and stood about the courtyard when it drew up. Some tossed their antlers, others pawed the ground as the step was let down, and Orlando alighted. One, it is said, actually knelt in the snow before her. She had not time to reach her hand towards the knocker before both wings of the great door were flung open, and there, with lights and torches held above their heads, were Mrs. Grimsditch, Mr. Dupper, and a whole retinue of servants come to greet her. But the orderly procession was... Sorry, hang on a second. But the orderly procession was interrupted first by the impetuosity of Canute, the elk hound, who threw himself with such ardor upon his mistress that he almost knocked her to the ground. Next, by the agitation of Mrs. Grimsditch, who, making as if to curtsy, was overcome with emotion and could do no more than gasp, "My lord, my lady, my lady, my lord," until Orlando comforted her with a hearty kiss upon both her cheeks. After that, Mr. Dupper began to read from a parchment, but the dog barking, the huntsmen winding their horns, winding their horns, and the stags who had come into the courtyard in the confusion, baying the moon, not much progress was made, and the company dispersed within after crowding about their mistress and testifying in every way to their great joy of her return. No one showed an instant's suspicion that Orlando was not the Orlando they had known. If any doubt there was in the human mind, the action of the deer and the dogs would have been enough to dispel it. But for the dumb creatures, as is well known, are far better judges both of identity and character than we are. Moreover, said Mrs. Grimsditch over her dish of China tea to Mr. Dupper that night, if her lord was a lady now, she had never seen a lovelier one, nor was there a penny piece to choose between them. One was as well favored as the other. They were as like as two peaches on the one branch, which, said Mrs. Grimsditch, becoming confidential, she had always had her suspicions, here she nodded her head very mysteriously, which it was no surprise to her, here she nodded her head very knowingly, and for her part a very great comfort. For what with the towels wanting mending, and the curtains in the chaplain's parlour being moth-eaten round the fringes, it was time they had a mistress among them, and some little masters and mistresses to come after her, Mr. Dupper added, being privileged by virtue of his holy office to speak his mind on such delicate matters as these. So while the old servants gossiped in the servants' wings, Orlando took a silver candle in her hand and roamed once more through the halls, the galleries, the courts, the bedrooms, saw loomed down at her again the dark visage of this Lord Keeper, that Lord Chamberlain, among her ancestors, sat now in this chair of state, now reclined in that canopy of delight, observed the arras, now how it swayed, watched the huntsman riding and Daphne flying, bathing her hand, as she had loved to do as a child, in the yellow pool of light which the moonlight made falling through the heraldic leopard in the window, slid along the polished planks of the gallery, the other side of which was rough timber, touched this silk, that satin, fancied the carved dolphins swam, brushed her hair with King James' silver brush, buried her face in the potpourri, which was made as the conqueror had taught them many hundreds of years ago, and from the same roses. Looked at the garden and imagined the sleeping crocuses, the dormant dahlias, saw the frail nymphs gleaming white in the snow, and the great yews hedges, thick as a house, black behind them, saw the orangeries and the giant medlars. All this she saw, and each sight and sound, rudely as we write it down, filled her heart with such a lust and balm of joy, that at length, tired out, she entered the chapel and sank into the old red armchair in which her ancestors used to hear service. There she lit a cheroot. 'Twas a habit she had brought back from the East, and opened the prayer book. So sorry. It was a little black book bound in... Oh, it was a little book bound... Yeah. Goodness. Hang on. You know, when you make one mistake and the more keep piling on. It was a little book bound in velvet, stitched with gold, which had been held by Mary Queen of Scots on the scaffold, and the eye of faith could detect a brownish stain, said to be made of a drop of the royal blood. But what pious thoughts it roused in Orlando, what evil passions it soothed sleep. Who dare say, seeing that it was all communions seeing that of all communions this with the deity is the most inscrutable. Novelist, poet, historian, all falter with their hand on that door. Nor does the believer himself enlighten us, for he is more ready to die than other people, or more eager to share his goods. Does he not keep as many maids and carriage houses as the rest, and yet with it all holds a faith, he says, which should make goods a vanity and death desirable? In the Queen's prayer book, along with the bloodstain, was also a lock of hair and a crumb of pastry. Orlando now added to these keepsakes a flake of tobacco. And so, reading and smoking, was moved by the humane jumble of them all, the hair, the pastry, the bloodstain, the tobacco, to such a mood of contemplation as gave her a reverent air suitable in the circumstances, though she had, it is said, no traffic with the usual god. Nothing, however, can be more arrogant, though nothing is commoner, than to assume that of gods there is only one, and of religions none but the speakers. Orlando, it seemed, had a faith of her own. With all the religious ardor in the world, she now reflected upon her sins, and the imperfections that had crept into her spiritual state. The letter S, she reflected, is the serpent in the poet's Eden, so what she would, there were still too many of these sinful reptiles in the first stanzas of the oak tree. But S was nothing, in her opinion, compared with the termination ing. The present participle is the devil himself, she thought, now that we are in the place for believing in devils. To evade such temptations is the first duty of the poet, so concluding, for as the ear is the antechamber to the soul, poetry can adulterate and destroy more surely than lust or gunpowder. The poet's, then, is the highest office of all, she continued. His words reach where others fall short. A silly song of Shakespeare's has done more for the poor and the wicked than all the preachers and the philanthropists in the world. No time, no devotion can be too great, therefore, which makes the vehicle of our message less distorting. We must shape our words so they are the thinnest integument for those thoughts. Thoughts are divine, etc. Thus it is obvious that she was back in the confines of her own religion, which time had only strengthened in her absence, and was rapidly acquiring the intolerance of belief. "I'm growing up," she thought, taking her taper at last. "I'm losing some illusions. she said, shutting Queen Mary's book. "Perhaps to acquire others." And as she descended among the tombs where the bones of her ancestors lie. But even the bones of her ancestors, Sir Miles, Sir Gervase, and the rest, had lost something of their sanctity since Rastuma Sadi had waved his hand that night in the Asian mountains. Somehow, the fact that only 300 or 400 years ago these skeletons had been men with their way to make in the world, like any modern upstart, and that they had made it by acquiring houses and offices, garters and ribands, as any other upstart does, while poets, perhaps, and men of great mind and breeding, had preferred the quietude of the country, for which choice they paid the penalty of extreme poverty, and now hawked broad sheets in the Strand, or herded sheep in the field, filled her with remorse. She thought of the Egyptian pyramids, and what bones lie beneath them, as she stood in the crypt, and the vast empty hills which lie above the Sea of Marmara seemed, for the moment, a finer dwelling-place than this many-roomed mansion in which no bed lacked its quilt and no silver dish its silver cover. "I'm growing up," she thought, taking her taper. "I'm losing my illusions, perhaps to acquire new ones." And she paced down the long gallery to her bedroom. It was a disagreeable process and a troublesome, but it was interesting, amazingly, she thought, stretching her legs out to her log fire, for no sailor was present, and she reviewed, as if it were an avenue of great edifices, the progress of her own self along her own past. How she had loved sound when she was a boy, and thought the volley of tumultuous syllables from the lips the finest of all poetry. Then, it was the effect of Sasha and her disillusionment, perhaps, into this high frenzy was let fall some black drop, which turned her rhapsody to sluggishness. Slowly there had opened within her something intricate and many-chambered, which one must take a torch to explore, in prose, not in verse, and she remembered how passionately she had studied that doctor at Norwich, Brown, whose book was at her hand there. She had formed here in solitude after her affair with Green, or tried to form, for heaven knows these growths are age-long in coming, a spirit capable of resistance. "I will write," she had said, "what I enjoy writing," and so had scratched out 26 volumes. Yet still, for all her travels and adventures and profound thinkings and turnings this way and that, she was only in process of fabrication. What the future might bring, heaven only knew. Change was incessant, and change perhaps would never cease. High battlements of thought, habits that had seemed durable as stone, went down like shadows at the touch of another mind, and left a naked sky and fresh stars twinkling in it. Here she went to the window, and in spite of the cold, could not help unlatching it. She leaned out into the damp night air. She heard a fox bark in the woods, and the clutter of a pheasant trailing through the branches. She heard the snow slither and flop from the roof to the ground. "By my life," she exclaimed, "this is 1,000 times better than Turkey. Rustum," she called, as if she were arguing with a gypsy, and in this new power of bearing an argument in mind and continuing it with someone who was not there to contradict, she showed again the development of her soul. "You were wrong. This is better than Turkey. Hair, pastry, tobacco. Of what odds and ends are we compounded?" she said, thinking of Queen Mary's prayer book. "What a phantasmagoria the mind is, and meeting place of dissemblables. At one moment we deplore our birth and state and aspire to an ascetic exaltation. The next we are overcome by the smell of some old garden path, and weep to hear the thrushes sing. and so bewildered as usual by the multitude of things which call for explanation, and imprint their message without leaving any hint as to their meaning, she threw her cheroot out of the window and went to bed. Next morning, in pursuance of these thoughts, she had out her pen and paper and started afresh upon the oak tree, for to have ink and paper in plenty when one has made do with berries and margins is a delight not to be conceived. Thus she was now striking out a phrase in the depths of despair, now in the heights of ecstasy, writing one in, when a shadow darkened the page. She hastily hid her manuscript. As her window gave on to the most central of the courts, as she had given orders that she would see no one, as she knew no one and was herself legally unknown, she was first surprised by the shadow, then indignant at it, then, when she looked up and saw what caused it, overcome with merriment, for it was a familiar shadow, a grotesque shadow of no less a personage than the Archduchess Harriet Griselda of Finster-Aarhorn, and Scandaboom in the Romanian territory. She was loping across the court in her old black riding habit and mantle as before. Not a hair of her head was changed. This, then, was the woman who had chased her from England. This was the eyrie of that obscene vulture. This was the fatal flower herself. At the thought that she had fled all the way to Turkey to avoid her seductress, now become excessively flat, Orlando laughed aloud. There was something inexpressibly comic in the sight. She resembled, as Orlando had thought before, nothing so much as a monstrous hare. She had the staring eyes, the lank cheeks, the high headdress of that animal. She stopped now, much as a hare sits erect in the corn, when thinking itself unobserved, and stared at Orlando, who stared back at her from the window. After they had stared like this for a certain time, there was nothing for it but to ask her in, and soon the two ladies were exchanging compliments, while the Archduchess struck the snow from her mantle. "A plague on women," said Orlando to herself, going to the cupboard to fetch a glass of wine. "They never leave one a moment's peace. A more ferreting, inquisiting, busybodying set of people don't exist. I was to escape this maypole that I left England, and now—" Here she turned to present the Archduchess with the salver, and behold, in her place stood a tall gentleman in black. A heap of clothes lay in the fender. She was alone with a man. Recalled this suddenly to a consciousness of her sex, which she had completely forgotten, and of his, which was now remote enough to be equally upsetting. Orlando first felt seized with faintness. "Oh!" she cried, putting her hand to her side. "How you frightened me!" "Gentle creature," cried the Archduchess, falling on one knee and at the same time pressing a cordial to Orlando's lips. "Forgive me for the deceit I have practiced on you." Orlando sipped the wine, and the Archduke knelt and kissed her hand. In short, they acted the parts of man and woman for 10 minutes with great vigor, and then fell into natural discourse. The Archduchess, for she must in future be known as the Archduke, told his story, that he was a man and always had been one, that he had seen a portrait of Orlando and fallen hopelessly in love with him, that to compass his ends he had dressed as a woman and lodged at the baker's shop, that he had desolated when he fled to Turkey, that he had heard of her change and hastened to offer his services. Here he teed and heed intolerably, for to him, the Archduke Henry, she was and would ever be the pink, the pearl, the perfection of her sex. With three P's would have been more persuasive if they had not been interspersed with tees and ha-has of the strangest kind. "If this is love," said Orlando to herself, looking at the Archduke on the other side of the fender, "and now from the woman's point of view, this is something highly ridiculous about it." Falling on his knees, the Archduke Harry made the most passionate declaration of his suit. He told her that he had something like 20 million ducats in a strong box at his castle. He had more acres than any nobleman in England. The shooting was excellent. He could promise her a mixed bag of ptarmigan and grouse such as no English moor or Scotch either could rival. True, the pheasants had suffered from the gape in his absence, and the does had slipped their young, but that could be put right, and he would be with her help, when they lived in Romania together. As he spoke, enormous tears formed in his rather prominent eyes, and he ran down the sandy tracts of his long and lanky cheeks. Oh, he didn't run. The tears ran. That men cry as frequently and as unreasonably as women, Orlando knew from her own experience as a man, but she was beginning to be aware that women should be shocked when men display emotion in their presence, and so shocked she was. The Archduke apologized. He commanded himself sufficiently to say that he would leave her now, but would return on the following day for his answer. That was Tuesday. He came on Wednesday. He came on Thursday. He came on Friday, and he came on Saturday. It is true that each visit began, continued, and concluded with a declaration of love, but in between there was much room for silence. They sat on either side of the fireplace, and sometimes the Archduke knocked over the fire-irons, and Orlando picked them up again. And then the Archduke would bethink him how he had shot an elk in Sweden, and Orlando would ask, was it a very big elk? The Archduke would say that it was not as big as the reindeer which he had shot in Norway, and Orlando would ask, had he ever shot a tiger? And the Archduke would say that he had shot an albatross, and Orlando would say, half hiding her yawn, was an albatross as big as an elephant? And the Archduke would say, something very sensible, no doubt, but Orlando heard it not, for she was looking at her writing table out of the window at the door. Upon which the Archduke would say, I adore you, at the very same moment that Orlando said, look, it's beginning to rain, at which they were both much embarrassed, and blushed scarlet, and would neither of them think what to say next. Indeed, Orlando was at her wits' end what to talk about, and had she not bethought her a game called Fly-Loo, at which great sums of money can be lost with very little expense of spirit, she would have had to marry him, she supposed, for how else to get rid of him she knew not. By this device, however, was a simple one, needing only 3 lumps of sugar and a sufficiency of flies. The embarrassment of conversation was overcome, and the necessity of marriage avoided. For now the Archduke would bet her 500 pounds to a tester that a fly would settle on this lump and not on that. Thus they would have occupation for a whole morning watching the flies, who were naturally sluggish at this season, and often spent an hour or so circling round the ceiling, until at length some fine blue-bottle made his choice, and the match was won. Many hundreds of pounds changed hands between them at this game, which the Archduke, who was a born gambler, swore was every bit as good as horse-racing, and vowed he would play at forever. But Orlando soon began to weary. What's the good of being a fine young woman in the prime of life, she said, if I had to pass all my mornings watching blue bottles with an Archduke? She began to detest the sight of sugar. Flies made her dizzy. Some way out of the difficulty there must be, she supposed, but she was still awkward in the arts of her sex, and she could no longer knock a man over the head or run him through the body with a rapier. She could think of no better method than this. She caught a blue bottle, gently pressed the life out of it. It was half dead already, or her kindness for the dumb creature would not have permitted it, and secured it by a drop of gum arabic to a lump of sugar. While the Archduke was gazing at the ceiling, she deftly substituted this lump for the one she had laid her money on, and cried, "Lou! Lou!" declared that she had won her bet. Her reckoning was that the Archduke, with all his knowledge of sporting and horse racing, would detect the fraud, and as to cheat at loo is the most heinous of crimes, and men have been banished from the society of mankind to that of apes in the tropics for ever because of it, she calculated that he would be manly enough to refuse to have anything further to do with her. But she misjudged the simplicity of the amiable nobleman. He was no nice judge of flies. A dead fly looked to him much the same as a living one. She played the trick 20 times on him, and he paid her over £17,250, which is about £40,885, 6 sickles, and 8 ducats, I'm assuming, of our own money, and that was about 100 years ago. So, a lot of money. Before Orlando cheated so grossly that even he could be deceived no longer. When he realized the truth at last, a painful scene ensued. The Archduke rose to his full height. He colored scarlet. Tears rolled down his cheeks one by one. That she had won a fortune from him was nothing. She was welcome to it. That she had deceived him was something. It hurt him to think her capable of it, but that she had cheated at loo was everything. To love a woman who cheated at play was, he said, impossible. Here he broke down completely. Happily, he said, recovering slightly, there was no witness. She was, after all, only a woman, he said. In short, he was preparing, in the chivalry of his heart, to forgive her, and had bent to ask her pardon for the violence of his language, when she cut the matter short, as he stooped his proud head, by dropping a small toad between his skin and his shirt. In justice to her, it must be said that she would infinitely have preferred a rapier. Toads are clammy things to conceal about one's person a whole morning, but if rapiers were forbidden, one must have recourse to toads. Moreover, toads and laughter between them sometimes do what cold steel cannot. She laughed. The Archduke blushed. She laughed. The Archduke cursed. She laughed. The Archduke slammed the door. "Heaven be praised!" cried Orlando, still laughing. She heard the sound of chariot wheels driven at a furious pace down the courtyard. She heard them rattle along the road. Fainter and fainter the sound became. Now it faded away altogether. "I am alone," said Orlando, aloud, since there was no one to hear. That silence is more profound after noise still wants the confirmation of science, but that loneliness is more apparent directly after one has been made love to. Many women would take their oath. Made love to, in the older, way back then, didn't just mean the act of, but also like the courting and the flirting and stuff like that, which I think is what they're going for this time. As the sound of the Archduke's chariot wheels died away, Orlando felt drawing further from her and further from her. An Archduke, she did not mind that. A fortune, she did not mind that. A title, she did not mind that. The safety and circumstances of married life, she did not mind that. But life she heard going from her, and a lover, life and a lover, she muttered. Going to her writing table, she dipped her pen in the ink and wrote, "Life and a lover," a line which did not scan and made no sense with what went before. Something about the proper way of dipping sheep to avoid the scab. Reading it over, she blushed and repeated, "Life and a lover." Then laying her pen aside, she went into her bedroom, stood in front of her mirror and arranged her pearls about her neck. Then, since pearls do not show to advantage against a morning gown of sprigged cotton, she changed to a dove-gray taffeta, thence to one of peach bloom, thence to a wine-colored brocade. Perhaps a dash of powder was needed, and if her hair was disposed so about her brow, it might become her. Then she slipped her feet into pointed slippers and drew an emerald ring upon her finger. "Now," she said, when all was ready and lit the silver sconces on either side of the mirror, what woman would not have kindled to see what Orlando saw then burning in the snow, for all about the looking-glass were snowy lawns, and she was like a fire, a burning bush, and the candle flames about her head were silver leaves, or again, the glass was green water, and she a mermaid, slung with pearls and siren in a cave, singing so that oarsmen leant from their boats and fell down to embrace her. So dark, so bright, so hard, so soft was she, so astonishingly seductive that it was 1,000 pities that there was no one there to put it in plain English, and say outright, "Damn it, madam, you are loveliness incarnate," which was the truth. Even Orlando, who had no conceit of her person, knew it, for she smiled the involuntary smile which women smile when their own beauty, which seems not their own, forms like a drop falling in a fountain, rising and comforts them all of a sudden in the glass, confronts them. This smile she smiled, and then she listened for a moment, and heard only the leaves blowing, and the sparrows twittering, and then she sighed, "Life, a lover." And then she turned on her heel with extraordinary rapidity, whipped her pearls from her neck, stripped the satins from her back, stood erect in the neat black silk knickerbockers of an ordinary noblewoman, and rang the bell. When the servants came, she told him to order a coach and 6 to be in readiness instantly. She was summoned by urgent affairs to London. Within an hour of the Archduke's departure, off she drove. Just taking a look to see how close we are to the end of the chapter. Not close at all. We have quite a ways to go. Yeah, we're about halfway through. I think this chapter is it's 50 pages long, so we are halfway through. And as she drove, we may seize the opportunity, since the landscape was a simple English kind which needs no description, to draw the reader's attention more particularly than we could at the moment to 1 or 2 remarks which have slipped in here and there in the course of this narrative. For example, it may have been observed that Orlando hid her manuscripts when interrupted. Next, that she looked long and intently in the glass, and now, as she drove to London, one might notice her staring and suppressing a cry when the horses galloped faster than she liked. Her modesty as to her riding, her vanity as to her person, her fears for her safety all seemed to hint that what was said a short time ago about there being no change in Orlando, the man, and Orlando, the woman, was ceasing to be altogether true. She was becoming a little more modest, as women are, or of her brains, and a little more vain, as women are, of her person. Certain susceptibilities were asserting themselves, and others were diminishing. A change of clothes had, some philosophers will say, much to do with it. Vain trifles as they seem, clothes have, they say, more important offices than merely to keep us warm. They change our view of the world, and the world's view of us. For example, when Captain Bartolus saw Orlando's skirt, he had an awning stretched for her immediately, pressed her to take another slice of beef, and inviting her to go ashore with him in the longboat. These compliments would certainly not have been paid her, had her skirts, instead of flowing, been cut tight to her legs in the fashion of breeches. And when we were paid compliments, it behoves us to make some return. Orlando curtsied. She complied. She flattered the good man's humours, as she would not have done had his neat breeches been a woman's skirts, and his braided coat a woman's satin bodice. Thus this is much to support the view that it is clothes that wear us, and not we them. Hey, Snockings, are you going to come visit me? Hi. You're cute. You coming up? Come on. Yes, you can come up. Hold that thought. We may have an approaching Snocking. See him coming up? Come on. You would be up, but you got caught. Okay. There we go. Here is our little overlord. You want to listen into Storytime some? Not sure? We'll see. She's not as excited about Storytime as either of my other kitties. My first cat, Walkie, loved being read to, and she was actually my very, very first audience, way back in my junior year when I was a little girl. Before you were born, Sunny, why, let me tell you, we used to read aloud in class, and all the other children, they would cringe when they heard me. They heard my name. No, you don't get to drink my water. Okay, bye. Sorry about the little break there. A kitty intermission. Alright. These compliments would certainly not have been paid her had her skirts, instead of flowing, been cut tight to her legs in the fashion of breeches. And when we are paid compliments, it behoves us to make some return. Orlando curtsied. She complied. She flattered the good man's humours, as she would not have done had his neat breeches been a woman's skirts, and his braided coat a woman's satin bodice. Thus there is much to support the view that it is clothes that wear us, and not we them. We may make them take the mold of arm or breast, but they would mold our hearts, our brains, our tongues to their liking. So, having now worn skirts for a considerable time, a certain change was visible in Orlando, which is to be found if the reader will look at page 111, even in her face. If we compare the picture of Orlando as a man, and that of Orlando as a woman, we shall see that, though both are undoubtedly one and the same person, there are certain changes. The man has his hand free to seize his sword. The woman must use hers to keep the satins from slipping from her shoulders. The man looks the world full in the face, as if we were made for his uses and fashioned to his liking. The woman takes a sidelong glance at it, full of subtlety, even of a suspicion. Had they both worn the same clothes, it is possible that their outlook might have been the same. That is the view of some philosophers and wise ones, but on the whole we incline to another. The difference between the sexes is, happily, one of great profundity. Clothes are but a symbol of something hid deep beneath. It was a change in Orlando herself that dictated her choice of a woman's dress and of a woman's sex, and perhaps it is this she was only expressing rather more openly than usual. Openness indeed was the soul of her nature, something that happens to most people without being thus plainly expressed. For here again we come to a dilemma. Different from the sexes are they intermix. In every human being, a vacillation from one sex to the other takes place, and often it is only the clothes that keep the male or female likeness, while underneath the sex is the very opposite of what it is above. Of the complications and confusions which thus result everyone has had experience. But here we leave the general question and note only the odd effect it had in the particular case of Orlando herself. for it was this mixture of her, in her of man and woman, one being uppermost and then the other, that often gave her conduct an unexpected turn. The curious of her own sex would argue, for example, if Orlando was a woman, how did she never take more than 10 minutes to dress? And were not her clothes chosen at random and sometimes worn rather shabby? And then they would say, still, she has none of the formalities of a man or a man's love of power. She is excessively tender-hearted. She could not endure to see a donkey beaten or a kitten drowned. Yet again, they noted, she detested household matters, and was up at dawn and out among the fields in summer before the sun had risen. No farmer knew more about the crops than she did. She could drink with the best and liked games of hazard. She drove well and drove 6 horses at a gallop over London Bridge. Yet again, though bold and active as a man, it was remarked that the sight of another in danger brought on the most womanly palpitations. She would burst into tears on silent provocation. She was unversed in geography, found mathematics intolerable, and held some caprices which are more common among women than men, as for instance that to travel south is to travel downhill. Whether, then, Orlando was most man or most woman, it is difficult to say and cannot now be decided. For her coach was now rattling on the cobbles. She was reaching her home in the city. Steps were being let down. The iron gates were being opened. She was entering her father's house at Blackfriars, which, though fashion was fast deserting that end of the town, was still a pleasant, roomy mansion with gardens running down to the river and a pleasant grove of tree-nuts to walk in. Here she took up her lodgings, and began instantly to look about her for what she had come in search of, that is to say, life and a lover. About the first thing there might be some doubt. The second she found, without the least difficulty, 2 days after her arrival. It was a Tuesday that she came to town. On Thursday she went for a walk in the Mall, as was then the habit of persons of quality. She had not made more than a turn or two of the avenue before she was observed by a little knot of vulgar people who go there to spy upon their betters. As she came past them, a common woman carrying a child at her breast stepped forward, peered familiarly into Orlando's face, and cried out, "Look upon us! If it ain't the Lady Orlando!" Her companions came crowding round, and Orlando found herself in a moment the centre of a mob of staring citizens and tradesmen's wives, all eager to gaze upon the heroine of the celebrated lawsuit. She was the interest that the case excited in the minds of the common people. She might indeed have found herself gravely discommoded by the pressure of the crowd. She had forgotten that ladies are not supposed to walk in public places alone, had not a tall gentleman at once stepped forward and offered her the protection of his arm. It was the Archduke. She was overcome with distress, and yet with some amusement at the sight. Not only had this magnanimous nobleman forgiven her, but in order to show that he took her levity with the toad in good part, he had procured a jewel made in the shape of that reptile, which he pressed upon her with a repetition of his suit as he handed her to her coach. What with the crowd, what with the Duke, what with the jewel, she drove home in the vilest temper imaginable. Was it impossible, then, to go for a walk without being half suffocated, presented with a toad set in emeralds, and asked in marriage by an archduke? She took a kinder view of the case next day, when she found on her breakfast table 6 billets from some of the greatest ladies in the land. Lady Suffolk, Lady Salisbury, Lady Chesterfield, Lady Tavistock, and others, who reminded her in the politest manner of old alliances between their families and their own, and desired the honour of her acquaintance. Next day, which was a Saturday, many of these great ladies waited on her in person. On Tuesday, about noon, their footman brought cards of invitation to various routes, dinners, and assemblies in the near future, so that Orlando was launched without delay, and with some splash and foam at that, upon the waters of London society. To give a truthful account of London society, at that or indeed at any other time, is beyond the powers of biographer and the historian. We got a little bit of a picture of it when we read Northanger Abbey. Is strange. Only those who have little need of the truth and no respect for it, the poets and the novelists, can be trusted to do it, for this is one of the cases where the truth does not exist. Nothing exists. The whole thing is a miasma, a mirage. To make our meaning plain, Orlando would come home from one of these routes at 3 or 4 in the morning, with cheeks like a Christmas tree and eyes like stars. She would untie a lace, pace the room a score of times, untie another lace, stop, and pace the room again. Often the sun would be blazing over Southwark chimneys before she could persuade herself to get into bed, and there she would lie, pitching and tossing, laughing and sighing for an hour or longer before she slept at all. And what was all this stir about? Society. And what had society said or done to throw a reasonable lady into such an excitement? In plain language, nothing. Rack her memory as she would. Next day, Orlando could never remember a single word to magnify into the name something. Lord O had been gallant, Lord A polite, the Marquis of C charming, Mr. M amusing. But when she tried to recollect in what their gallantry, politeness, charm, or wit had consisted, she was bound to suppose her memory at fault, for she could not name a thing. It was the same always. Nothing remained over the next day, yet the excitement of the moment was intense. Thus we were forced to conclude that society is one of those brews, such as skilled housekeepers serve hot about Christmas time, whose flavor depends upon the proper mixing and stirring of a dozen different ingredients. Taking one out, and it is itself insipid. Take away Lord O, Lord A, Lord C, and Mr. M, and separately each is nothing. Stir them all together, and they combine to give off the most intoxicating flavors and most seductive of scents. Yet this intoxication, this seductiveness, entirely evades our analysis. At one and the same time, therefore, society is everything and society is nothing. Society is the most powerful concoction in the world, and society has no existence whatsoever. Such monsters as the poets and novelists alone can deal with such something nothings. Their works are stuffed out to prodigious size, and to them, with the best will in the world, we are content to leave it. I guess a good one to read to get an idea of the ones that we've read in Storytime would be, gosh, why am I blanking on it? Picture of Dorian Gray, that's the one I was thinking of, because he was very deep into society. Following the example of our predecessors, therefore, we will only say that society in the reign of Queen Anne was of unparalleled brilliance. To have the entry there was the aim of every well-bred person. The graces were supreme. Fathers instructed their sons, mothers their daughters. No education was complete for either sex which did not include the science of deportment, the art of bowing and curtsying, the management of the sword and the fan, the care of the teeth, the conduct of the leg, the flexibility of the knee, the proper methods of entering and leaving the room, with 1,000 etceteras, such as will immediately suggest themselves to anybody who has himself been in society. Since Orlando had won the praise of Queen Elizabeth for the way she handed a bowl or rose-water as a boy, it must be supposed that she was sufficiently expert to pass muster. Yet it is true that there was an absent-mindedness about her which sometimes made her clumsy. She was apt to think of poetry when she should have been thinking of taffeta, or walk with a little too much of a stride for a woman, perhaps, and her gestures, being abrupt, might endanger a cup of tea on occasion. This kind of reminds me, sorry, I'm going to pause the narrative a little moment. The whole, breeding for society is really interesting. You've probably heard of, like, what are they called? Debutantes. A debutante refers to usually a woman. I don't think they really refer to men at all, but a lady of station who has been trained her entire life on proper conduct of society and all the manners and all of the, idle chatter and all of that stuff. And so their debut season is the season when they officially enter into society, and they are known as debutantes. And there was a really interesting book that I read. There's maybe about 8 or so years old. Was it Elizabeth Ross who's the author? But it's called Belle Époque, and it takes place in the late 1800s in France. And I don't know if it's based on something that actually happened, but I wouldn't be surprised at all. But it is based on a poem that was written in France called Les Repoussoirs, which referred to women who were professionally ugly or professionally flawed, and they were hired by women of society to be seen around town with, or in the society circles, and by comparison the women of society would look lovelier. I guess you could say like the designated fat friend or the designated ugly friend. Because, if I stood beside you, you would look very thin. And it's just these people that their livelihood depended on their flaws and their repulsiveness. Because the repoussoir, I think, is like they're the repulsors, and so your eye automatically goes over the other one, the lovelier one. Very interesting intricacies of society of all sorts. So it's interesting, like you read those historical novels and you get kind of an idea of the little facets of what life was like. I'm not sorry that I don't live in those times, I will tell you that much. Although it would be a good way of making money. Anyways, we will continue. Okay. Oh, no worries, Carell. I hope you're doing okay. I'm gonna let Maestro show again. No worries. Like, I forgot to put up the July schedule anyways. It hasn't changed from the June schedule, but still, I should have put that up there. I'm so sorry that your life has not been doing all right. I hope that it improves. And I hope that you're keeping cool and trying to, finding a good way to cope and to deal and stuff like that. We all kind of have to do our own thing as well. Like, I have a fan going at all times. Just kind of gives the brain something to focus on. Makes it less thinking about just a whole bunch of other things. But we can chat a little bit more later. I'll go ahead and continue. And don't be sorry at all. It's quite all right. Whether the slight disability was enough to counterbalance the splendor of her bearing, or whether she inherited a drop too much of that black humor which ran in the veins of all her race, certain it is that she had not been in the world more than a score of times before she might have been heard to ask herself, had there been anybody but her spaniel Pippin to hear her, "What the devil is the matter with me?" The occasion was Tuesday, 16 June, 1712. She had just returned from a great ball at Arlington House, The dawn was in the sky, and she was pulling off her stockings. "I don't care if I never meet another soul as long as I live," cried Orlando, bursting into tears. Lovers she had in plenty, but life, which is, after all, of some importance in its way, escaped her. "Is this," she asked, but there was none to answer. "Is this," she finished her sentence all the same, "what people call life?" The spaniel raised her forepaw in a token of sympathy. The spaniel licked Orlando with her tongue. Orlando stroked the spaniel with her hand. Orlando kissed the spaniel with her lips. In short, there was the truest sympathy between them that can be between dog and its mistress, and yet it cannot be denied that the dumbness of animals is a great impediment to the refinements of intercourse. They wag their tails, they bow the front part of the body, and elevate the hind. They roll, they jump, they paw, they whine, they bark, they slobber. They have all sorts of ceremonies and artifices of their own, but the whole thing is of no avail, since speak they cannot. Such was their quarrel, she thought, setting the dog gently on the floor, with a great pool at Arlington House. They, too, wag their tails, bow, roll, jump, paw, and slobber. But they cannot talk. All these mouths that I've been out in the world. All these months that I've been out in the world, said Orlando, pitching one stocking across the room. I've heard nothing but what Pippin might have said. I'm cold. I'm hungry. I'm happy. I've caught a mouse. I've buried a bone. Please kiss my nose. And it was not enough. How, in so short a time, she had passed from intoxication to disgust, we will only seek to explain by supposing that this mysterious composition, which we call society, is neither actually good or bad in itself, but has a spirit in it, volatile but potent, which either makes you drunk when you think it, as Orlando thought it, delightful, or gives you a headache when you think it, as Orlando thought it, repulsive. That the faculty of speech has much to do with it either way, we take leave to doubt. Often a dumb hour is the most ravishing of all. Brilliant wit can be tedious beyond description, but to the poets we leave it, and so on with our story. Orlando threw the second stocking after the first and went to bed dismally enough, determined that she would forswear society forever. But again, as it turned out, she was too hasty in coming to her conclusions. For the very next morning she woke up to find, among the usual cards of invitation upon her table, one from a certain great lady, the Countess of R. Having determined overnight that she would never go into society again, we can only explain Orlando's behavior. She sent a messenger hot foot to R. house, to say that she would attend her ladyship with all the pleasure of the world, by the fact that she was still suffering from the effect of 3 honeyed words dropped into her ear on the deck of the Enamoured Lady by Captain Nicholas Benedict Bartolus as they sailed down the Thames. Addison, Dryden, Pope, he had said, pointing to the cocoa tree, and Addison, Dryden, Pope had chimed in her head like an incantation ever since. Who can credit such folly? But so it was. All her experience with Nick Green had taught her nothing. Such names still exercised over her the most powerful fascination. Something, perhaps, we must believe in, and as Orlando, we have said, had no belief in the usual divinities, she bestowed her credulity upon great men, yet with a distinction. Admirals, soldiers, statesmen moved her not at all, but the very thought of a great writer stirred her to such a pitch of belief that she almost believed him to be invisible. Her instinct was a sound one. One can only believe entirely, perhaps, in what one cannot see. The little glimpse she had of these great men from the deck of the ship was of the nature of a vision. That the cup was china, or the Gazette paper, she doubted. When Lord O. said one day that he had dined with Dryden the night before, she flatly disbelieved him. Now the Lady R's reception room had the reputation of being the antechamber in the presence room of genius. It was the place where men and women met to swing censers and chant hymns to the bust of genius in a niche in the wall. Sometimes the god himself vouchsafed his presence for a moment. Intellect alone admitted the suppliant, and nothing, so the report ran, was said inside that was not witty. It was thus with great trepidation that Orlando entered the room. She found a company already assembled in a semicircle round the fire. Lady R, an oldish lady of dark complexion with a black lace matilla on her head, was seated in a great arm-chair in the centre. Thus, being somewhat deaf, she could control the conversation on both sides of her. On both sides of her sat men and women of the highest distinction. Every man, it was said, had been a prime minister, and every woman, it was whispered, had been the mistress of a king. Certain it is that all were brilliant and all were famous. Orlando took her seat with a deep reverence and silence. After 3 hours she curtsied profoundly and left. But what, the reader may ask with some exasperation, happened in between? In 3 hours such a company must have said the wittiest, the profoundest, the most interesting things in the world. So it would seem indeed. But the fact appears to be that they said nothing. It is a curious characteristic which they share with all the most brilliant societies that the world has seen. Old Madame du Deffand and her friends talked for 50 years without stopping, and of it all, what remains? Perhaps 3 witty sayings. So that we were at liberty to suppose either that nothing was said, or that nothing witty was said, or that the fraction of 3 witty sayings lasted 18,250 nights, which does not leave a liberal allowance for wit for any one of them. The truth would seem to be that, if we dare use such a word in such a connection, that all these groups of people lie under an enchantment. The hostess is our modern Sibyl. She is a witch who lays her guests under a spell. In this house they think themselves happy, and in a third profound. It is all an illusion, which is nothing against it, for illusions are the most valuable and necessary of things, and she who can create one is among the world's greatest benefactors. But as it is notorious that illusions are shattered by conflict with reality, so no real happiness, no real wit, no real profundity are tolerated where the illusion prevails. This serves to explain why Madame de Deffand said no more than 3 witty things in the course of 50 years. Had she said more, her circle would have been destroyed. The witticism, as it left her lips, bowled over the current conversation as a cannonball lays low the violets and the daisies. When she made her famous mot de Saint-Denis, the very grass was singed. Disillusionment and desolation followed. Not a word was uttered. "Spare us another such, for heaven's sakes, madame!" their friends cried with one accord. And she obeyed. For almost 17 years she said nothing memorable, and all went well. The beautiful counterpane of illusion lay unbroken on her circle, as it lay unbroken on the circle of the Lady R. The guests thought that they were happy, thought that they were witty, thought that they were profound, and as they thought this, other people thought it still more strongly, and so it got about that nothing was more delightful than one of Lady R's assemblies. Everyone envied those who were admitted. Those who were admitted envied themselves because other people envied them, and so there seemed no end to it, except that which we have now to relate. For about the 3rd time Orlando went there, a certain incident occurred. She was still under the She was still under the illusion that she was listening to the most brilliant epigrams in the world, though, as a matter of fact, old General C was only saying at some length how the gout had left his left leg and gone to his right, while Mr. L interrupted, when any proper name was mentioned. R? Oh, I know Billy R as well as I know myself, S. My dearest friend. T stayed with him a fortnight in Yorkshire, which, such is the force of allusion, sounded like the wittiest repartee, the most searching comment upon human life, and kept the company in a roar. When the door opened, and a little gentleman entered whose name Orlando did not catch. Soon a curiously disagreeable sensation came over her. To judge from their faces, the rest began to feel it as well. One gentleman said there was a draught. The Marchioness of C feared a cat must be under the sofa. It was as if their eyes were being slowly opened upon a pleasant dream, and nothing met them but a cheap washstand and a dirty counterpane. It was as if the fumes of some delicious wine were slowly leaving them. Still, the General talked, and still Mr. L remembered. But it became more and more apparent how red the General's neck was, how bald Mr. L's head was. As for what they said, nothing more tedious and trivial could be imagined. Everybody fidgeted, and those who had fans yawned behind them. At last, Lady R rapped with hers upon the arm of her great chair. Both gentlemen stopped talking. Then the little gentleman said. He said next. He said finally, "Here it cannot be denied was true wit, true wisdom, true profundity." The company was thrown into complete dismay. One such saying was bad enough, but 3, one after another, on the same evening? No society could survive it. And yes, it was blank after. He said next, and he said finally. "Mr. Pope," said old Lady R, in a voice trembling with a sarcastic fury, "you are pleased to be witty." Mr. Pope flushed red. Nobody spoke a word. They sat in dead silence some 20 minutes. Then, one by one, they rose and slunk from the room. That they would ever come back after such an experience was doubtful. Link boys could be heard calling their coaches all down South Audley Street. Doors were slammed and carriages drove off. Orlando found herself near Mr. Pope on the staircase. His lean and misshapen frame was shaken by a variety of emotions. Darts of malice, rage, triumph, wit, and terror, he was shaking like a leaf, shot from his eyes. He looked like some squat beetle set with a burning topaz on his forehead. At the same time, the strangest tempest of emotion seized now upon the luckless Orlando. A disillusionment so complete as that inflicted not an hour ago leaves the mind rocking from side to side. Everything appears 10 times more bare and stark than before. It is a moment fraught with the highest danger for the human spirit. Women turn nuns and men priests in such moments. In such moments rich men sign away their wealth, and happy men cut their throats with carving knives. Orlando would have done all willingly, but there was a rasher thing still for her to do, and this she did. She invited Mr. Pope to come home with her. For if it is rash to walk into a lion's den unarmed, rash to navigate the Atlantic in a rowing boat, rash to stand on one foot on the top of St. Paul's, it is still more rash to go home alone with a poet. A poet is Atlantic and lion in one. While one drowns us, the other gnaws us. If we survive the teeth, we succumb to the waves. The man who can destroy illusions is both beast and flood. Illusions are to the soul what atmosphere is to the earth. Roll up that tender air and the plant dies. The color fades. The earth we walk on is a parched cinder. It is marl we tread, and fiery cobbles scorch our feet. by the time we are undone. Life is a dream. 'Tis waking that kills us. Who would rob us of our dreams, robs us of our life, and so on for 6 pages if you will, but the style is tedious and may well be dropped. I love how snarky she is. On this showing, however, Orlando should have been a heap of cinders by the time the chariot drew up at her house in Blackfriars. That she was still flesh and blood, though certainly exhausted, is certainly due to a fact to which we drew attention earlier in the narrative. The less we see, the more we believe. Now the streets that lie between Mayfair and Blackfriars were at that time very imperfectly lit. True, the lighting was a great improvement upon that of the Elizabethan age. Then the benighted traveller had to trust to the stars, or the red flame of some night watchman to save him from the gravel pits at Dark Lane, or the oak woods, where swine rooted in the Tottenham Court Road. But even so, it wanted much of our modern efficiency. Lamp-posts lit with oil lamps occurred every 200 yards or so, but between lay a considerable stretch of pitch darkness. Thus, for 10 minutes, Orlando and Mr. Pope would be in darkness, and then for about half a minute again in the light. A very strange state of mind was thus bred in Orlando. As the light faded, she began to feel steal over her the most delicious balm. This is indeed a very great honor for a young woman to be driving with Mr. Pope, she began to think, looking at the outline of his nose. I am the most blessed of my sex. Half an inch of me, indeed. I feel the knot of his knee ribbons pressing against my thigh. It is the greatest wit in Her Majesty's dominions. Future ages will think of us with curiosity and envy me with fury. Here came the lamp-post again. What a foolish wretch I am, she thought. There is no such thing as fame and glory. Ages to come will never cast a thought on me or on Mr. Pope either. What's an age indeed? What are we? And their blind process through Berkeley Square seemed the groping of 2 blind ants momentarily thrown together without interest or concern in common across a blackened desert. She shivered. But here again was darkness. Her illusion revived. How noble his brow is, she thought, mistaking a lump on a cushion for Mr. Pope's forehead in the darkness. What a weight of genius lives in it! What wit, wisdom, and truth! What a wealth of all those jewels, indeed, for which people are ready to barter their lives! Yours is the only light that burns forever, but for you the human pilgrimage would be performed in utter darkness. Here the coach gave a great lurch as it fell into a rut in Park Lane. Without genius we should be upset and undone. Most august, most lucid of beams. Thus she was apostrophizing the humps on the cushion when they drove beneath one of the street lamps in Berkeley Square, and she realized her mistake. Mr. Pope had a forehead no bigger than another man's. Wretched man, she thought, how you have deceived me! I took that hump for your forehead. When one sees you plain, how ignoble, how despicable you are! Deformed and weakly, there is nothing to venerate in you, much to pity, most to despise. Again they were in darkness, and her anger became modified directly. She could see nothing but the poet's knees. But it is I that am a wretch, she reflected, once they were in complete obscurity again. For base as you may be, am I not still baser? It is you who nourish and protect me, you who scare the wild beast, frighten the savage, make me clothes of the silkworm's wool, the carpets of the sheep's. If I went to worship, have you not provided me with an image of yourself, and set it in the sky? Are not evidences of your care everywhere? How humble, how grateful, how docile should I not be therefore? Let it be all my joy to serve, honor, and obey you. Here they reached the big lamp-post at the corner of what is now Piccadilly Circus. The light blazed in her eyes, and she saw, beside some degraded creatures of her own sex, 2 wretched pygmies in a stark desert island. Both were naked, solitary, and defenseless. The one was powerless to help the other. Each had enough to do to look after itself. Looking Mr. Pope full in the face, "It is equally vain," she thought, "for you to think you can protect me, or for me to think I can worship you. The light of truth beats upon us without shadow, and the light of truth is damnably unbecoming of us both." All this time, of course, they went on talking agreeably, as people of birth and education use, about the Queen's temper and the Prime Minister's gout, while the coach went from light to darkness, down the Haymarket, along the Strand, up Fleet Street, and reached, at length, her house in Blackfriars. For some time the dark spaces between the lamps had been becoming brighter, and the lamps themselves less bright. That is to say, the sun was rising, and it was in the equable but confused light of a summer's morning, in which everything is seen but nothing is seen distinctly, that they alighted, Mr. Pope handing Orlando from her carriage, and Orlando curtsying Mr. Pope to precede her into the mansion with the most scrupulous attention to the rites of the graces. From the foregoing passage, however, it must not be supposed that genius, but the disease is now stamped out in the British Isles, and the late Lord Tennyson, it is said, being the last person to suffer from it, is constantly alight, for then we should see everything plain, and perhaps should be scorched to death in the process. Rather it resembles the lighthouse in its working, which sends one ray, and then no more for a time, save that genius is more than capricious in its manifestations, and may flash 6 or 7 beams in quick succession, as Mr. Pope did that night, and then lapse into darkness for a year or forever. To steer by its beams is therefore impossible, and when the dark spell is on them, men of genius are, it is said, much like other people. It was happy for Orlando, though at first disappointing, that this should be so, for she now began to live much in the company of men of genius. Nor were they so different from the rest of us as one might have supposed. Addison, Pope, Swift proved, she found, to be fond of tea. They liked arbors. They collected little bits of colored glass. They adored grottos. Rank was not distasteful to them. Praise was delightful. They wore plum-colored suits one day and gray another. Mr. Swift had a fine Malacca cane. Mr. Addison scented his handkerchiefs. Mr. Pope suffered with his head. A piece of gossip did not come amiss, nor were they without their jealousies. We are jotting down a few reflections that came to Orlando's higgledy-piggledy. At first, she was annoyed with herself for noticing such trifles, and kept a book in which to write down their memorable sayings. But the page remained empty. All the same, her spirits... Hey, kickin'? Okay. You have to keep the peace. Oh, no. I'm sorry to hear that. We're almost done. Well, no, we still have a little... We have about 10 pages left to go with story time, by the way. Oh, no, please don't. I know, that's really tough being the mediator. Ooh. But I hope you can keep saying... Please do keep saying for my sake. Well, for your sake, mostly. Oh, my goodness. Everybody's. You can do it. I believe in you. I'll continue. Let's see. All the same, her spirits revived, and she took to tearing up her cards of invitation to great parties, kept her evenings free, began to look forward to Mr. Pope's visit, to Mr. Addison's, to Mr. Swift's, and so on and so on. If the reader will here refer to the Rape of the Lock, to the Spectator, to Gulliver's Travels, he will understand precisely what these mysterious words may mean. Indeed, biographers and critics might save themselves all their labors if reading would only take this advice. For when we read, whether the nymph shall break Diana's law, or some frail china jar receive a flaw, or stain her honor or her new brocade, forget her prayers, or miss a masquerade, or lose her heart or necklace at a ball. Okay. I hope you survive. Good luck to you. I will see you next time. And I will be knocking on wood for you. We know as if we had heard him now. Mr. Pope's tongue flickered like a lizard, and how his eyes flashed, how his hand trembled, how he loved, how he lied, how he suffered. In short, every secret of a writer's soul, every experience of his life, every quality of his mind is written large in his works. Yet we require critics to explain the one, and biographers to expound the other. That time hangs heavy on people's hands is the only explanation of the monstrous growth. So, now that we have read a page or two of The Rape of the Lock, we know exactly why Orlando was so much amused and so much frightened and so very bright-cheeked and bright-eyed that afternoon. Mrs. Nelly then knocked at the door to say that Mr. Addison waited on her ladyship. At this, Mr. Pope got up with a wry smile, made his congee, and limped off. In came Mr. Addison. Let us, as he takes his seat, read the following passage from the Spectator. I consider woman as a beautiful, romantic animal that may be adorned with furs and feathers, pearls and diamonds, ores and silks. The lynx shall cast its skin at her feet to make her a tippet. The peacock, parrot, and swan shall pay contributions to her muff. The sea shall be searched for shells, and the rocks for gems, and every part of nature furnish out its share towards the embellishment of a creature that is the most consummate work of it. All this I shall indulge them in, but as for the petticoat I have been speaking of, I neither can nor will allow it. We hold that gentleman, cocked hat and all, in the hollow of our hands. Look once more into the crystal. Is he not clear to the very wrinkle in his stockings? Does not every ripple and curve of his wit lie exposed before us, and his benignity, or benignity? I don't know how you pronounce it. And his timidity and his urbanity, and the fact that he would marry a countess and die very respectably in the end. All is clear. And when Mr. Addison has said his say, there is a terrific rap at the door, and Mr. Swift, Jonathan Swift, who had these arbitrary ways with him, walks in unannounced. One moment. Where is Gulliver's Travels? Here it is. Let us read a passage from the voyage of the Honeyhumhums. Okay. I enjoyed perfect health of body and tranquillity of mind. I did not find the treachery or inconsistency of a friend, nor the injuries of a secret or open enemy. I had no occasion of bribing, flattering, or pimping to procure the favor of any great man, or of his minion. I wanted no fence against fraud or oppression. Here was neither physician to destroy my body, nor lawyer to ruin my fortune, no informer to watch my words and actions, or forge accusations against me for hire. Here were no gibers, censures, backbiters, pickpockets, highwaymen, housebreakers, attorneys, bawds, buffoons, gamesters, politicians, wits, splenetics, tedious talkers, Yes, splenetic, tedious talk. That's a phrase. But stop, your iron pelt of words, lest you flay us all alive, and you yourself too. Nothing can be plainer than that violent man. He's so coarse and yet so clean, so brutal yet so kind. Scorns the whole world, yet talks baby language to a girl and will die, can we doubt? In a madhouse. So Orlando poured out tea for them all, and sometimes, when the weather was fine, she carried them down to the country with her and feasted them royally in the round parlor which she had hung with her pictures all in a circle, so that Mr. Pope could not say that Mr. Addison came before him, or the other way about. They were very witty, too, but their wit is all in their books, and taught her the most important part of style, which is the natural run of the voice in speaking, a quality which none that has not heard it can imitate, not Green even, with all his skill. For it is born of the air, and breaks like a wave on the furniture, and rolls and fades away, and is never to be recaptured, least of all by those who prick up their ears half a century later and try. They taught her this merely by the cadence of their voices in speech, so that her style changed somewhat, and she wrote some very pleasant, witty verses and characters in prose. And so she lavished her wine on them, and put bank notes, which they took very kindly, beneath their plates at dinner, and accepted their dedications, and thought herself highly honored by the exchange. Thus time ran on, and Orlando, which could often be heard saying to herself with an emphasis which might perhaps make the hearer a little suspicious, "Upon my soul, what a life it is!" for she was still in search of that commodity. But circumstances soon forced her to consider the matter more narrowly. One day she was pouring out tea for Mr. Pope, while, as anyone can tell from the verses quoted above, he sat very bright-eyed, observant, and all crumpled up in a chair by her side. "Lord," she thought, as she raised the sugar tongs, "how women in ages to come will envy me!" And yet she paused, for Mr. Pope needed her attention, and yet let us finish her thought for her when anybody says, "How future ages will envy me," it is safe to say that they are extremely uneasy at the present moment. Was this life quite so exciting, quite so flattering, quite so glorious as it sounds when the memoir writer has done his work upon it? For one thing, Orlando had a positive hatred of tea. For another, in the intellect, divine as it is, and all worshipful, has a habit of lodging in the most seedy of carcasses, and often, alas, acts the cannibal amongst the other faculties so often, when the mind is biggest, the heart, the senses, magnanimity, charity, tolerance, kindliness, and the rest of them scarcely have room to breathe. Then the high opinion poets have of themselves. Then the low one they have of others. Then the enmities, injuries, envies, and repartees in which they are constantly engaged. Then the volubility with which they impart them. Then the rapacity with which they demand sympathy for them. All this, one may whisper, lest the wits may overhear us, makes pouring out tea a more precarious and, indeed, arduous occupation than is generally allowed. Added to which, we whisper again, lest the women overhear us, there is a little secret which men share among them. Lord Chesterfield whispered it to his son with strict injunctions to secrecy. Women are but children of a larger growth. A man of sense only trifles with them, plays with them, humors and flatters them, which, since children always hear what they are not meant to, and sometimes even grow up, may have somehow leaked out, so that the whole ceremony of pouring out tea is a curious one. A woman knows very well that though a wit sends her his poems, praises her judgment, solicits her criticism, and drinks her tea, This by no means signifies that he respects her opinion, admires her understanding, or will refuse, though the rapier is denied him, to run her through the body with his pen. All this, we say, whisper it as low as we can, may have leaked out by now, so that even the cream jug suspended and the sugar tongs distended, the ladies may fidget a little, look out the window a little, yawn a little, and so let the sugar fall with a great plop, as Orlando did now, into Mr. Pope's tea. Never was any mortal so ready to suspect an insult, or so quick to avenge one, as Mr. Pope. He turned to Orlando and presented her instantly with a rough draft of a certain famous line in the characters of women. Much polish was afterwards bestowed on it, but even in the original it was striking enough. Orlando received it with a curtsy. Mr. Pope left her with a bow. Orlando, to cool her cheeks, for really she felt as if the little man had struck her, strolled in the nut grove at the bottom of the garden. Soon the cool breezes did their work. To her amazement, she found that she was hugely relieved to find herself alone. She watched the merry boatloads rowing up the river. No doubt the sight put her in mind of one or two incidents in her past life. She sat herself down in profound meditation beneath the fine willow tree. There she sat till the stars were in the sky. Then she rose, turned, and went into the house, where she sought her bedroom and locked the door. Now she opened a cupboard in which hung still many of the clothes she had worn as a young man of fashion, and from among them she chose a black velvet suit richly trimmed with Venetian lace. It was a little out of fashion, indeed, but it fitted her to perfection, and dressed in it she looked the very figure of a noble lord. She took a turn or two before the mirror to make sure that her petticoats had not lost her freedom of her legs, and then let herself secretly out of the doors. It was a fine night early in April, myriad stars mingling with the light of the sickle moon, which again were forced by the street lamps, made a light infinitely becoming of the human countenance and to the architecture of Mr. Wren. Everything appeared in its tenderest form, yet just as it seemed on the point of dissolution, some drop of silver sharpened it to an animation. Thus it was that talk should be, thought Orlando, indulging in foolish reverie, that society should be, that friendship should be, that love should be. Oh, hi, how are you doing, Sen? Sorry, I didn't notice until now. I was a bit, fully engrossed. For, heaven knows why, just as we have lost faith in human intercourse, some random collocation of barns and trees, or a haystack and a wagon, presents us with so perfect a symbol of what is unattainable, that we begin to search again. She entered Leicester Square as she made these observations. The buildings had an airy yet formal symmetry, not theirs by day. The canopy of the sky seemed most dexterously washed in to fill up the outline of roof and chimney. A young woman who sat dejectedly with one arm dropping by her side, the other reposing in her lap, on a seat beneath a plane tree in the middle of the square, seemed the very figure of grace, simplicity, and desolation. Orlando swept her hat off to her in the manner of a gallant paying his addresses to a lady of fashion in a public place. The young woman raised her head. It was of the most exquisite shapeliness. The young woman raised her eyes. Orlando saw them to be of a luster such as is sometimes seen on teapots, but rarely in a human face. Through this silver gaze the young woman looked up at him, for a man he was to her, appealing, hoping, trembling, fearing. She rose. She accepted his arm. For need we stress their point, she was of the tribe which nightly burnishes their wares, and sets them in order on the common counter to wait the highest bidder. She led Orlando to the room on Gerrard Street, which was her lodging. To feel her hanging lightly, yet like a suppliant on her arm, roused in Orlando all the feelings which became a man. She looked, she felt, she talked like one. Yet having been so lately a woman herself, she suspected that the girl's timidity and her hesitating answer and the very fumbling with the key and the latch in the fold of her cloak and the droop of her wrist were all put on to gratify her masculinity. Upstairs they went, and the pains which the poor creature had been at to decorate her room and hide the fact that she had no other deceived Orlando not a moment. The deception roused her scorn. The truth roused her pity. One thing showing through the other bred the oddest assortment of feelings, so that she did not know whether to laugh or cry. Meanwhile, Nell, as the girl called herself, unbuttoned her gloves, carefully concealed the left-hand thumb, which wanted mending, then drew behind a screen where, perhaps, she rouged her cheeks, arranged her clothes, fixed a new kerchief round her neck, all the time prattling as women do to amuse her lover, though Orlando could have sworn, from the tone of her voice, that her thoughts were elsewhere. When all was ready, out she came, prepared. But here Orlando could stand it no longer. In the strangest torment of anger, merriment, and pity, she flung off all the disguises and admitted herself a woman. At this, Nell burst into such a roar of laughter as might have been held across the way. "Well, my dear," she said, when she had somewhat recovered, "I'm by no means sorry to hear it, for the plain Dunstable of the matter is," and it was remarkable how soon, on discovering that they were of the same sex, her manner changed and she dropped her plaintive, appealing ways. "The plain Dunstable of the matter is that I'm not in the mood for the society of the other sex tonight. Indeed, I'm in the devil of a fix." Whereupon, drawing up the fire and stirring a bowl of punch, she told Orlando the whole story of her life. Since it is Orlando's life that engages us at present, we need not relate the adventures of the other lady, but it is certain that Orlando had never known the hours speed faster or more merrily, though Mistress Nell had not a particle of wit about her, and when the name of Mr. Pope came up in talk, asked innocently if he were connected with the peruke maker of that name in Jermyn Street, Jermyn. Yet to Orlando, such is the charm of ease and the seduction of beauty, this poor girl's talk, larded though it was with the commonest expression of the street corners, tasted like wine after the fine phrases she had been used to, and she was forced to the conclusion that there was something in the sneer of Mr. Pope, in the condescension of Mr. Addison, and in the secret of Lord Chesterfield, which took away her relish for the society of wits, deeply though she must continue to respect their works. These poor creatures, she ascertained, for Nell brought Prue and Prue Kitty and Kitty Rose, had a society of their own, of which they now elected her a member. Each would tell the story of the adventures they had landed her in the present way of life. Which had landed her. Yeah, there we go. Several were the natural daughters of earls, and one was a good deal nearer than she should have been to the king's person. None was too wretched or too poor, but to have some ring or handkerchief in her pocket, which stood her in lieu of pedigree. So they would draw round the punch bowl, which Orlando made it her business to furnish generously, and many were the fine tales they told, and many the amusing observations they made. For it cannot be denied that when women get together, but hissed, they were always careful to see that the doors were shut, and not a word of it gets into print. All they desire is, but hissed again, is that not a man step on the stairs. All they desire, they were about to say when the gentleman took the very words out of our mouths. Women have no desires, says this gentleman, coming into Nell's parlor, only affectations. Without desires, she had served him, and he is gone, their conversation cannot be of the slightest interest to anyone. It is well known, says Mr. S.W., that when they lack the stimulus of the other sex, women can find nothing to say to each other. When they are alone, they do not talk, they scratch. And since they cannot talk together, and scratching cannot continue without interruption, and it is well known, Mr. T. Horace proved it, that women are incapable of any feeling of affection for their own sex, and hold each other in the greatest aversion, what can we suppose that women do when they seek out each other's society? As that is not a question that can engage the attention of a sensible man, let us, who enjoy the immunity of our biographers and historians from any sex whatever, pass it over, and merely state that Orlando professed great enjoyment in the society of her own sex, and leave it to the gentlemen to prove, as they are very fond of doing, that this is impossible. But to give an exact and particular account of Orlando's life at this time becomes more and more out of the question. As we peer and grope in the ill-lit, ill-paved, ill-ventilated courtyards that lay around Gerrard Street and Drury Lane at that time, we seem now to cast sight of her, and then again to lose it. The task is made still more difficult by the fact that she found it convenient at this time to change frequently from one set of clothes to another. Thus she often occurs in contemporary memoirs as Lord So-and-so, who was in fact her cousin. Her bounty is ascribed to him, and it is he who is said to have written the poems that were really hers. She had, it seems, no difficulty in sustaining the different parts, for her sex changed far more frequently than those who have worn only one set of clothes can conceive, nor can there be any doubt that she reaped a twofold harvest by this device. The pleasures of life were increased, and its experiences multiplied. For the probity of the breeches, she exchanged the seductiveness of petticoats, and enjoyed the love of both sexes equally. So one may sketch her spending her morning in a China robe of ambiguous gender among her books, then receiving a client or two, for she had many scores of suppliants, in the same garment. Then she would take a turn in the garden and clip the tree nuts, for which knee breeches were convenient. Then she would change into a flowered taffeta, which best suited to a drive to Richmond, and a proposal of marriage from some great nobleman, and so back again to town, where she would don a snuff-colored gown like a lawyer's, and visit the courts to hear how her cases were doing. For her fortune was wasting hourly, and the suits seemed no nearer consummation than they had been 100 years ago. And so finally, when night came, she would more often than not become a nobleman, complete from head to toe, and walk the streets in search of adventure. Returning from some of these junkets, of which there were many stories told at the time, as that she fought a duel, served on one of the king's ships as a captain, was seen to dance naked on a balcony, and fled with a certain lady to the Low Countries, where the lady's husband followed them, but of the truth or otherwise of these stories we express no opinion. Returning from whatever her occupation may have been, she made a point sometimes of passing beneath the windows of a coffee-house, where she could see the wits without being seen, and thus could fancy from their gestures what wise, witty, or spiteful things they were saying without hearing a word of them, which was perhaps an advantage, and once she stood half an hour watching 3 shadows on the blind drinking tea together in a house in Bolt Court. Never was any play so absorbing. She wanted to cry out, "Bravo! Bravo!" For to be sure, what a fine drama it was. What a page torn from the thickest volume of human life. There was the little shadow with the pouting lips, fidgeting this way and that on his chair, uneasy, petulant, officious. There was the bent female shadow, crooking a finger in the cup to feel how deep the tea was, for she was blind. And there was the Roman-looking, rolling shadow in the big armchair, who was he who twisted his fingers so oddly, and jerked his head from side to side, and swallowed down the tea in such vast gulps. Dr. Johnson, Mr. Boswell, and Mrs. Williams, those were the shadow's names. So absorbed was she in the sight that she forgot to think how other ages would have envied her, though it seems probable that on this occasion they would. She was content to gaze and gaze. At length Mr. Boswell rose. He saluted the old woman with tart asperity. But with what humility did he not abase himself before the great Roman shadow, who now rose to its full height, and rocking somewhat as he stood there, rolled out the most magnificent phrases which ever left human lips. So Orlando thought them, though she never heard a word that any of the three shadows said as they sat there drinking tea. At length she came home one night after one of these saunterings, and mounted to her bedroom. She took off her laced coat, and stood there in shirt and breeches, looking out of the window. There was something stirring in the air which forbade her to go to bed. A white haze lay over the town, for it was a frosty night in midwinter, and a magnificent vista lay all round her. She could see St. Paul's, the Tower, Westminster Abbey, with all the spires and domes of the city churches, and smooth bulk of its banks, the opulent and ample curves of its halls and meeting-places. On the north rose the smooth, shorn heights of Hampstead, and in the west the streets and squares of Mayfair shone out in one clear radiance. Upon this serene and orderly prospect the stars looked down, glittering, positive, hard from a cloudless sky. In the extreme clearness of the atmosphere, the line of every roof, the cowl of every chimney was perceptible. Even the cobbles in the street shone distinct one from another. And Orlando could not help comparing this orderly scene with the irregular and huddled purlieus which had been the city of London in the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Then she remembered the city, if such one could call it, lay crowded, a mere huddle and conglomeration of houses, under her window at Blackfriars. The stars reflected themselves in deep pits of stagnant water which lay in the middle of the streets. A black shadow at the corner, where the wine-shop used to stand, was, as likely or not, the corpse of a murdered man. She could remember the cries of many a one wounded in such night brawlings when she was a little boy, held to the diamond-paned window in her nurse's arm. Troops of ruffians, men and women, unspeakingly interlaced, lurched down the streets, trolling out wild songs with jewels flashing in their ears and knives gleaming in their fists. One such a night as this, the impermeable tangle of the forest in Highgate and Hampstead would be outlined, writhing in contorted intricacy against the sky. Here and there, on one of the hills which rose above London, was a stark gallows tree with a corpse nailed to the rot or parch on its cross. For danger and insecurity, lust and violence, poetry and filth swarmed over the tortuous Elizabethan highways, and buzzed and stank. Orlando could remember even now the smell of them on a hot night, in the little rooms and narrow pathways of the city. Now she leant out of her window. All was light, order, and serenity. There was the faint rattle of a coach on the cobbles. She heard the faraway cry of the night watchman. "Just 12 o'clock on a frosty morning." No sooner had the words left his lips than the first stroke of midnight sounded. Orlando then for the first time noticed a small cloud gathering behind the dome of St. Paul's. As the strokes sounded, the cloud increased, and she saw it darken and spread with extraordinary speed. At the same time, a light breeze rose, and by the time the 6th stroke of midnight had struck, the whole of the eastern sky was covered with an irregular moving darkness, though the sky to the west and north stayed clear as ever. Then the clouds spread north. Height upon height above the city was engulfed by it. Only Mayfair, with all its light shining, burnt more brilliantly than ever by contrast. With the 8th stroke, some hurrying tatters of clouds sprawled over Piccadilly. These seemed to mass themselves and to advance with extraordinary rapidity towards the West End. As the 9th, 10th, and 11th strokes struck, a huge blackness sprawled over the whole of London. With the 12th stroke of midnight, the darkness was complete. A turbulent welter of cloud covered the city. All was darkness, all was doubt, all was confusion. The 18th century was over. The 19th century had begun. Ooh. I had heard that this was kind of a journey through the ages, so now we've reached that part. I am intrigued. Though, of course, we will have to hear about that tomorrow. So we're going to go ahead and end our story time here. Yes, kitty treats. I will go grab the kitties, and thank you for the hydration reminder. All right, let's go grab Stockings and Maestro. Snackings. Maestro, you too. That was interesting. All right, let's see if they come. Oops. Come here. Snackings, Maestro, come on. We'll see. Snockings is in her scratching post, so sometimes she gets a bit grumpy and bitey. Hey, Pants. You're so sulky. Come here, sulky boy. Yep, I know. Hi, say hi. Let's see if he will deign to eat. I will definitely do that, yeah. This is from Corel. Did you get them all? You got them all. He's being a big lump of sulkiness right now. Thank you. All right. Do you have any suggestions or requests for who to raid? I know I saw Mr. Multi streaming earlier, but I know that he is Central Europe time, which it's pretty late in the day. So let's see who we have. All right. Leah's streaming again. I know I've been raiding her quite a few times. Oh, we have Coffee with B and Queer God. Ooh. Yeah, let's raid Queer God. We haven't raided her in a while, and it would be a great one too. Thanks, you too. I'm going to be staying home the whole day. I hope that you stay cool, stay healthy. I hope things get better for you. Okay, and oops. Forgot the R. There we go. Get the raid message ready. All right. I will see you next time. Next story time is tomorrow, 2 to 4 Pacific time. We're going to be continuing with Orlando. I hope to see you then. If not, Have a safe 4th if you're in the States. Have a safe weekend. Stay cool or stay warm wherever you are. Bye.